All right. Welcome everyone. It is Thursday, February 7th, 2019. This is the Kubernetes SIG Architecture meeting, just to make sure you're in the right place. I'm your host. I'm one of the three chairs for the project here, and I'm Jay Singer-Dumars, and I work at Google. And we're going to go ahead and get started. If you want to follow along at the agenda, it is available at bit.ly/sig-architecture. And before we get into the agenda, I just want to make a quick reminder of our working agreements, which is make feedback constructive and actionable, favor work over discussion when possible, and if you've got a comment, try chat first. And if you're talking more than listening, please be mindful of others who have not spoken. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the agenda. And I believe, Aaron, that is you to start off this whole shebang.
It is, and I'm at a place that doesn't have great bandwidth, so I'm not going to share my screen, and it's hopefully going to force me into a mode of more listening than speaking.
Can I interrupt 1 second? If somebody could volunteer to take notes in the agenda, that would be super helpful.
I will.
Thank you so much, Matt. All right, Aaron, it's all yours. Sorry.
So I've been yanked around to a bunch of things to the point where I haven't actually had time to go and review all of the KEPs. But my spot check of all of the KEPs is that they are all of wildly varying degrees of quality and specificity when it comes to what I am interested in from a release team perspective, which is graduation criteria in the form of a checklist and a test plan that makes it really easy for the CI signal people to understand, is this feature actually passing its tests, yes or no? So my hope here is that we as a community can rally around trying to get some level of consistency here and some level of making these things actionable, and trying to get these things locked in place prior to burn down. So burn down is basically like a week to a week and a half away from code freeze. It is week 8 of the release cycle. The release cycle is 12 weeks long. Code freeze starts at week 9. The hope here is that this means that the goalposts are set in stone a week and a half prior to code freeze, so nobody is surprised if we're saying this shouldn't land prior to code freeze. But, you know, like Caleb's not here, so he can't say, and I told you so. But to nobody's surprise, like, this is really difficult to keep track of because it basically involves humans staring at a spreadsheet and then trying to reconcile that against issues and then trying to reconcile that against documents which have multiple PRs made against multiple cycles. So this is as bumpy as I expected. But I do think on a positive note, the community heard the rallying cry loud and clear that if you don't have a KEP, you don't land. So everybody really did try. So like, I'll probably have a lot more substantive feedback in terms of friction and consistency from my end once I actually have the time to roll through all of this. I'm far more interested in hearing everybody else's thoughts and perspective.
If you want to talk, raise your hand, as Stephen has done. So Stephen, you got the floor.
Hey, so to Aaron's point, yes, we did know it was going to be bumpy. I like that Aaron was kind of a bull in a china shop, as he said, and forced the issue for 114. So I think that we're capturing a lot of good feedback around the KEP process. All that said, there is a new KEP template that is up for review. So everyone who's interested in having feedback on that process, like, we'd like to get it in soon so that it's a little clearer for everyone, but we want to make sure that it's done the right way. So please review the template, and if you have suggestions for changes, please let me know.
Joe.
See, I think, you know, there's dual purposes for KEPs, and I think, you know, I don't want us to, like, one of those things is to be able to communicate plans and sort of architectural decisions and features that people are talking about so that we can get some review, get some eyes, get some process before people write a boatload of code. that's separate from sort of the feature release stuff. So I think, as we go through and add more to the template, as we go through is make this part of the release process, I think that's important, but I don't want us to actually make it look so overwhelming that people try to hide it or don't share their ideas or try to sneak stuff through. So I feel like there's a balance here, and maybe there's a way that like we can have like, okay, what does a KEP need so that it can get implementable? And then what is and then there's like, okay, what are the things necessary for release? And I'm not quite sure how to tease these things apart, but I just don't want this thing to be like a wall of like stuff you have to do, every time you want to do anything, which I think would people then hide.
Agreed. Stephen.
Hey, so I think it's worthwhile to make it clear and have it on recording that the intent for, at least one of the intents for KEPs are to merge early and iterate often, right? So making sure that, like, honestly, when a KEP is in provisional state, in a draft state, the expectation is that we have a summary and motivation and some light goals, right? So once that's laid down, I think that's fine to merge. The understanding should be that moving into the implementable stage, that the bar gets raised a little bit, right? So that's what laying down that checklist is for. And it's definitely not perfect yet, but I think that at least having it in place will bring us to a place that we can get it a little tighter.
Perhaps we could add the possibility of having like the life cycle of a KEP, just so the expectations are clear. Because I totally agree. When I first looked at it, I was a little overwhelmed by if a person just wants to do a new experimental feature, it can seem overwhelming.
Aaron, and then Stephen.
Yeah, so I think I'm in violent agreement. Like, if I had more time, I would have been vicious on that template. It bothers me that there are like over 10 people listed as reviewers on that, and that it's been hanging out for N weeks, when really what I would have appreciated is if we had gotten just the testing and upgrade downgrade headings in there and then locked that in place so that the community as a whole could have just started with that. It led to mass confusion, and it concerns me that it follows a pattern this group sometimes follows, where we try to do the small thing and then we bike shed and it gets huge and massive. And now we have this big overwhelming wall of text. And I totally want the stupid, simple thing now that's easier to automate rather than the big, massive wall of text. So I'm really interested in how we can, like, okay, this one got big and we're going to try and land it somehow, but how can we make sure that when we move forward, we actually do iterate in smaller, discrete chunks? Second thing I'll throw out there is I feel like we have an issue that is sort of a friction log for KEPs. I know Brian Grant commented on it to drop his comment about how like it was difficult to follow up on reviews across multiple PRs. Does anybody have that issue link offhand? Okay. Because I feel like I'd like to make sure as we proceed here, I'm trying to gather feedback both from a release perspective in the retro, but also for SIG PM's benefit. I think we should have like an ongoing friction log.
I have the same issue about comments being smeared across multiple PRs because they got merged early, and then when I actually go to review, there isn't actually an open PR to make comments on, and so I find myself making comments on the last PR just because there's nowhere else to make them, and then you get comments across lots of others. So,
Stephen?
Hey, so part of the plan for what I wanted to do, and Aaron and I talked about it briefly, and he was like, I just want to land this PR, was to improve the documentation across the entire repo as well. And that was gonna balloon into something pretty ridiculous. So there is a plan to make sure that it's clear how to move through each of those stages, and that will be included in a follow-up PR for that repo. For this template, to kind of allay the confusion that's been happening, I would like to maybe set a time box on the comments and reviews so that we can get it merged in, and then we can iterate on some of the stuff that is active there.
I had a comment, which is just as we're going through this process of looking at KEPs and how we document them, I would ask us to continually look at the compass point of what are we actually trying to accomplish by having the KEP in the first place. I mean, I know it's the sort of general keeper of all the documentation around the things we want to do, but understanding the needs of the various stakeholders is also really important. And sometimes stakeholders need more, sometimes they need less. And so the more we focus on just meeting the minimum needs of each stakeholder, the better off we are, because it can't be everything to everyone. So it's better to just align with specific concerns and each SIG, their needs and specifically how we move forward in architecture and how we review things. Because to me, it's a little bit unclear about how we actually queue up reviews and what it needs to go through architecture review. And are we more of a standard setting body, or are we enforcement, escalation? And I think over time with these things that we're going to be less of a decision maker and more of a create the standards and help the decisions be pushed lower in the stack. So having KEPs work for that use case, I think makes a ton of sense. Aaron?
Yeah, so just from a vision perspective, since I think I got the point across for you can't land in a release unless you have a KEP, like my vision is we smush all the things into a KEP. So there's no design proposal anymore. There's just a KEP. There is ideally not even an enhancement tracking issue anymore. There's just a KEP. And to Joe's point, I agree. I don't want to have like huge, massive, high friction process for just doing a thing. So we should make sure we find a way to communicate the appropriate level of fidelity. But yes, one data with many views would be super ideal. I just kind of want to gradually smush everybody over to that place. The feedback I need to hear about this is like we've already smushed everything over to KEPs, and that has introduced some degree of friction. Is this too much friction? Is there too much noise? Should we slow down and work on consistency and automation, or should we keep pushing? Right? I don't know that I'm looking for an answer now, although I will definitely take feedback, but that's the general thing to keep in mind. Because right now, I'm trending towards just smush it all into one place.
Aaron, thanks for driving this. Thanks for making this a first-class concern for this release. And we are out of time for this topic, and we're going to move on to the next. Stephen, you just raised your hand. Can you make it in less than a minute?
Yeah, sure. So the plan is to smush all of the stuff and eventually like have a different presentation mechanism for these, like the contributor side. So it's mentioning on the community call just now. What we would like to do as well is if you're having bandwidth concerns around getting things reviewed or reviewing things yourself, please continue, like start adding more reviewers to your SIG specific subdirectory in the KEPs folder.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Also, I want to acknowledge the work that you've done here and helped raise visibility as well. So again, thanks. Super appreciated. All right, moving on to the next agenda item, CRD and Extension Management. This has been a hot topic. I'm going to go ahead and hand the floor to Tim because you seem to be the one of the triumvirate here. I don't see.
So there's been a lot of conversations between a group between storage, SIG cluster lifecycle, and some API reviewers. And I kind of wanted to start framing the conversation first before we start getting into the logistics of what it means to manage it, because I don't even know the entire framing of the debate. Right? So let's frame the conversation. What is kind of happening is we are slowly piecing apart the API and having CRDs were meant to be an extension point to the main API. But now, as time has progressed, folks have seen it as an option for how to sort of federate the actual core API itself. And one question I have, and I haven't gotten a clean answer on it, I think I'd like to record it here for posterity so it helps to frame the conversation, is that what is the promise of having core APIs as CRDs? Or what does the end user get and what do the developers get?
Joe's got his hand up. And then Joe, if you can use the raise hand function on Zoom, it makes it easier.
Okay, yeah. Did anybody else have their hand up there? I don't want to.
You're up first.
Yeah, I think for me, this is interesting in a couple of ways. It keeps us honest and it makes sure it's a forcing function to make sure that CRDs are first-class citizens and that we don't, cheat for our core APIs. And so it forces some of the discussions that we're having now. Early on with Kubernetes, the way that we broke out the controller manager and the scheduler was a forcing function to make sure that we put everything through our API surface area. And I think that over time that proved effective. And so I think this is sort of in the similar vein of keeping ourselves honest. That's my take on it.
That's a developer-centric view of it, right? So that's good. What I'm trying to tease apart is who are the personas and who cares about this, because that will affect the implementation details. So there's certain personas here, but one thing I've never understood, and I know Jordan, you probably have comments here, from an end user perspective, like what is their view? What do they get out of this?
Brendan Byrne's
So
hands it up.
I think there's a couple of different thoughts here. I think one thing to acknowledge is that for a certain class of API objects, it could very well be that most end users don't get any benefit out of this, right? That this is purely optimization for engineering and for the way that we develop things, as Joe said, rather than an end user benefit. However, I think that you can look at things like Darren's, what is it, K3S or whatever, where he went in and in the code stripped out a ton of functionality that he didn't want, that would point to an end user benefit to some people for not having everything be linked in. And I think the further you go out into the spectrum, the more the extensibility becomes an end user feature, where I think it's really good that we could have 3 different workflow implementations as Kubernetes native APIs. So I think it's one of these situations where the benefit in the core is for developers of Kubernetes, and the benefits in the periphery are for users of Kubernetes. And I don't know that we have to ensure that the balance is the same in the core as in the periphery.
Okay. So I'd like to extrapolate on this because I want to really frame the conversation. What are the core benefits to the developer community? Let's be concrete. What are the key things that the developer gains for making the core APIs, not just the core APIs to be CRDs?
I think that's the point. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Joseph. As a newcomer to the community, I can tell you that the benefit for people like me is that made the overall architecture predictable. I know what I want to find because the pattern repeats. And that's something I appreciate. It's like because now it's huge. I mean, it's so huge that every component has a different way to do stuff, and you cannot easily move from one area to another. But now it's a read that a new proposal API is on these ideas. I have already an idea how it will more or less work. So for me, it's saving a lot of time just to understand the overall concept, which sometimes it's hard to put in the architecture. This is what I really appreciate about any architecture, is that makes me understand quickly what's the way of thinking on this. This is my overall theme of the stuff. For me, it's a benefit, definitely.
So if I were to summarize that, you would say consistency for how the APIs are managed and looked at and versioned, etc.
Yeah, I mean, you can easily move from one area to another. Now the surface of the architecture is so big and it's growing so fast that will basically is the only way to allow developers to move to one area to another. As I say, I know they have been working for now. My focus now is cluster API, but I also interested in the part of the volume management. If everything is done the same, I can quickly move there. I know what I want to find. Everything will look like familiar, and mostly, if based on that, I expect that some of the implementation partner will repeat. So I will reuse my skills. If I implement a controller in this area, I can use the same skill to implement another controller in another area, because I think this is a huge advantage. I mean, really.
Great, thanks for that perspective, Pablo. Hand the floor to Brendan Burns and then over to Dems next, please.
So to answer Tim's question, I think that there are 2 benefits to developers. So I want to be clear, I don't think that we should break out existing core APIs, right? If it's already in there, I don't see a lot of value in breaking them out, right? So I don't know if that was under consideration, but that doesn't seem like there's a ton of gain. But for new APIs that are core, you get a lot of agility to implement independent of the release cycle of the main core cadence, and also the sort of spaghetti hairball that is most of the code that's in there. I think it's just way lighter for someone to create and manage a loop around a CRD, even if that loop will eventually be migrated into some other controller or some meta controller. And then also, I think, part of it is just the ability and flexibility to experiment in the SIG long before you write a KEP or anything like that, right? Like, I'm a big believer in development first and documentation second, because the first development is for learning. And so I think if everything has to go into the core, those PRs don't merge until you go through all of the bureaucracy. I don't think that's good for agility or fail fast.
Dims?
Okay, so right now, CRDs are second-class citizens, right? Just because the people who are on this call don't really do CRDs on a day-to-day basis, but we are forcing other people to do it. Now, once we switch over and say that any new stuff has to be CRDs, and maybe we'll consider existing stuff also as CRDs, we are forcing ourselves to fix a bunch of issues that other people are seeing, and it's not hitting us. And the first thing that hit us was the CSI one, for example, and what happened in the previous meeting where we said, okay, fine, let's get some of the CSI stuff into main KK repository. That's what we ended up. So we have like a two-tier system right now, and we shouldn't be there. We should get to a point where we are making things easier for everybody else who is building on top of us.
Thanks, Dims. Jordan?
I agree on benefits of fast prototyping. Anytime you have something that the built-in components are depending on, I don't think you actually gain velocity improvements with CRDs because you can't ship changes to the kubelet and how it consumes an API, whether it's CRD based or not, faster than the Kubernetes release cadence.
Okay. Matt?
So I think it really actually plays nicely into SIGs doing quick prototyping. To build on what Brendan said, a SIG or more than one SIG could do something in Kubernetes SIGs, iterate on it, prototype it, work it out, hash it out. Maybe even over some releases, people could start running this in different places in production. And then when you want to bring it into core, the workflow works really nicely to just bring it right into core, ship it as default, and maybe even different distributions would do that as well, right? The workflow seems really nice when you want to create something new and experiment with it without sticking it into the core and having to deal with release cycles and things like that. You can just play with it where it needs to be, and people can hash it out and try and iterate. That seems like a nice flow, and then it fits real nice into core. So I kind of like this workflow.
All right. So I'm sorry, I'm doing a lousy job moderating here. There's a lot of people competing for the mic. So Tim's leading the section. He asked for us to move on in time box soon. So let's try and go through this as best we can. Brendan, let's cut the comments after you, but in the meantime, we'll do Justin, Ken, Brendan, Solly, or Justin, Ken, Brendan, then Solly. That makes sense?
Okay.
I think I saw a bunch of hands in that room, right?
Yeah, we'll give it to that room because there's several.
I think one of the things that CRDs potentially enable is decoupling rolling out a new schema or a new version from rolling out the binary that writes it or reads it. And I think that's one of the things that can enable smoother upgrades and possibly even downgrades than we have had to date. So I think that is definitely a huge advantage if we can figure out that workflow.
Yeah, I think that is something I mentioned in the chat also. That's what I meant.
I was going to say that I think the reality is that custom resource definitions we're calling them beta, but we don't know how to do things like update them. We don't understand the interaction of custom resource definitions with core resource definitions in terms of what you're allowed to define and what you're not. And if the promise we're making to people is that we will provide you a set of core resources, but you can extend your clusters to add functionality as you see fit, we need to live up to that promise. And I don't see how we're ever going to do that unless we move the direction of there's no custom resource definition, there's just resource definitions. And we have uniform tooling, whether you're modifying something in the core, modifying your own custom resource definition, or whatever, in order to help you enable the resources in your cluster.
I think Brendan is next.
Yeah, Brendan?
I was just going to respond to what I think Jordan said about the kubelet, which is, I don't actually think that that's true now that we've broken out CRI and CSI as separate things. You could always land a separate CRI that has, the capabilities you need and pass things through the kubelet via annotations or anything else like that. It's a very narrow point. I'm going to shut up now in interest of time.
Yeah, but the things that are actually externalized, I agree with you. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing things in tree, like literally calling these APIs. So, yeah.
We also get a lot of resistance anytime we.
Next.
I was just briefly kind of related to that. It really depends on like the tightness of the coupling on the particular API, right? Like if the kubelet references a single field and the rest of you have another controller that's operating on the rest of the CRD, you could potentially add additional fields to the CRD. The kubelet would continue to be able to interact with it, and the external controller you could iterate on, add additional fields that it interacted with.
So if I were to summarize, I want to keep moving here. If I were to summarize, the whole idea in summary is consistency, dogfooding what we're doing, as well as being able to rapidly prototype to move things out faster into the wild and to have potentially different ways of managing the API over time, or APIs, right? So that's good feedback. I wanted to frame the conversation as that, because that's the first part from a developer. It's very developer centric. It's very developer focused. But I also want to put on my consumer hat, because as SIG Cluster Lifecycle Co-Chair, I get the end user feedback of what happens when developers move fast, but don't necessarily always put the end user's frame of reference in mind. So as we go through some of these options that people have iterated in the document, I want to make sure that people are well abreast and aware that consumers just want it to work, and they don't want to manage this. And putting any type of management in their court, I think, would be detrimental. So the automation and the life cycle and the management of this needs to be clean and well thought out through before we actually push this on the end consumer. I'm going to probably switch over now to the options that are listed in the doc. Do folks have a link to the doc?
Yeah. Hey, Tim, one quick thing. Stephen had his hand up for a while. I think he had one quick thing before we close up this section.
Yeah, so just a basic idea about the pounding away at the keps again. I don't think it's bad or wrong to lay this down in a KEP first, even if the KEP is provisional. Like, we have additional statuses in the KEPs, like deferred or rejected, to actually at least capture the motivation and goals of the idea. And if it's not a good idea, then fine, toss it. But at least we've captured that feedback, and it serves the community in future if someone brings that idea back around.
Yeah, it was one of the things that was in my list. Do we have a full-blown KEP that articulates our conversation pieces that we've had here?
I don't think we do. I don't think there's anything. Yeah, this is relatively new case law. So,
do folks think that we should?
Google room?
Yes, absolutely.
I think this is core to the whole project, to the point where it really needs to be really well documented.
Yeah. Again, not to harp on it, but I think we need to begin documenting people investing time in documenting these standards, and so SIGs are better equipped to make these decisions.
So we do have I don't know if this quite captures the scope. I've only been halfway following, but we do have a KEP around the CRD installation mechanism. Do you think that covers what you all are discussing, or is this broader?
Broader. That's part of it, for sure. All right, so can we take a potential action item for some SIG to own the creation of some of the pieces that we have here? Because right now, I've never had a full encompassing view as well as I've had articulated in this conversation.
Looks like Brendan offered to write something. It looks like Brian Grant, you shared a document. I didn't open that. Did you want to give any context on that?
This was are we on meeting? Yeah. This was the document that was shared last week. I did not write the document. I think Justin could speak better to it.
Yeah, I think this is the doc that Tim was probably about to talk about.
Yep.
Where we explore the options for installation, right, Tim?
Yes. So I think one of the things that we were harping on as part of the conversation was that we should really articulate in a CAP form what the promise and ideas are behind this migration of core APIs to CRDs. And with that in mind, and someone said Brendan offered to write up the CRD philosophy doc. That'd be awesome. With that in mind, we could probably move to the actual options that we kind of enumerated. And again, I want to reiterate the end user perspective from my end. Justin, you were involved in this too, along with Tim. Do you want to start to iterate through some of those options?
I'm happy to give a summary if you'd like that. So the core problem is the core problem that this doc is looking at is exactly how do we install these CRDs that are like core or not strictly optional. And we put out of scope discussion of circular dependencies and that sort of thing. It's important, but not necessarily this discussion. There were, I think, 4 alternatives that we came up with, including having the API server sort of load a directory of CRDs, having a component, a sort of standalone component that does that, having Kube Controller Manager be that component, and then I think the 4th option is sort of the minimal option where we just define a bunch of YAML and say it is up to the tooling to install it, which is quite similar to what we have today, and that we should like give guidance on that, and ideally we would actually write code in Cluster API and KubeADM, for example, to actually prove that that works.
Has everyone had a chance to see the document? Is the link accessible publicly?
I think we're discussing putting it on Kubernetes Dev for read-only, so.
Okay.
So the presentation that was shared also is not accessible to most folks.
Yeah. So if folks have the document open, maybe we can screen share and so we can walk through some of the details there and have feedback about what people think about the different options. Does that seem like a legitimate way to start to discuss the options there? Silence is acceptance.
Yeah, so this is just to be clear, this is the one that says public ideas for CRD loading for non-add-on APIs?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll see if I
so
can share.
the doc, so I just requested access for SIG Arch.
If you are in the SIG Arch group, you should have access.
Okay. So he outlined some of the non-goals up above and the goals, and I recommend reading that. But I think the purpose of discussing it here in this group is to talk about the logistics of the different options that exist. The first option here is like to add a new kube schema loader component, right? Creating a binary that's part of the Kubernetes release and expected to run in the control plane nodes alongside the controller manager API server in the cluster. This could be continuous control with a simple cron job or yada, yada, yada. Those are the pros and cons. Do folks want to discuss that potential option?
Sorry, which option was this? I was taking notes. It's hard to take notes and participate at the same time.
Number 1.
Number 1.
I think one of the things we thought about this, to summarize, was that this felt very similar to other add-ons, and that sort of might motivate why I think our group leaned towards a particular option that is number 4, right?
Yes, we did. I think the problem, I wanted to make sure folks at least had enough time to read and understand the different options there, because this is going to matter. This is how we're going to basically manage APIs in perpetuity. Right.
So maybe it would help to just like quickly read what that option number 1 is. The schema loader component that is a binary that's part of the release and runs on control plane nodes or in the cluster, the continuous controller or a cron job pointed at a binary of YAML and applies it to the API server. Maybe it'd help to just outline the 4 options. So
sure. Next one is to add a schema loader controller to the controller manager. This would be in tree. I particularly kind of like this one because I think the maintenance, I leaned into it, because the maintenance is then in core, right? because I'm concerned that if you have core APIs as CRDs in a federated fashion, management of that and consistent management of that could become fragmented. The next one is making the API server load a directory of YAML. This would basically be the CRD definitions. I wasn't against or for this one. I think Daniel actually had comments on the last one. The last one is define a bundle and make each installer handle it, which is the add-ons philosophy. So it's basically building it into the system in some way, shape, or form, or having it as a versioned component outside of it that's managed.
Joe, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say that, like, with number 3, and I'm not sure how this works with HA, but it feels a little bit analogous to static pod manifests, right? Where it's like there's a directory, this stuff sort of gets integrated, but the source of truth is no longer etcd, the source of truth is actually local. I'm just like, I'm not sure if that's good or bad. I just like, there seems to be a parallel there.
I can say whether it's good or bad because it's basically what we did in GKE, and it's pretty bad, especially for HA. I mean, that's what the add-on manager script does in the cluster directory right now for anybody who uses that, not just GKE. And it gets you into this case where you have to figure out the state. You have to go look at local disks of a bunch of machines, and to fix it, you have to figure out how to update that state on those machines. And it's impossible to synchronize it across HA with all the existing upgrade tools that are out there, or with any of them, rather. I mean, none of them actually do that I'm aware in the way that you would want. So,
yeah, this seems like it would import all the problems of like our command line flags, right?
Yes, for example. So just my take on some of the others. Well, I have 4 here. The earlier option, I forget which one it is, the number 2. Oh, so an issue with number 2, the schema loader controller. I mean, I actually sort of proposed something similar in the architectural roadmap doc in April 2017, basically predicting that we would have this issue eventually, even if we wanted to do things like extract the cloud controller manager. We ran into this issue when we extracted the scheduler about how do we make architecturally visible changes to the system and not break every blog post and installation tool and everything in the universe. As we built the extension mechanisms, I think we have a lot more insight into it now than we did then. But it's clear that it's just loading the schema is not sufficient. You also need webhooks. You need something to receive the webhooks. You need a controller. You need RBAC rules. You may need namespaces. Like the number of different kinds of things you need starts to really look like arbitrary add-ons. So I think we need to take that context into account with whichever option we choose.
Jordan?
I think we want to also be clear about like exactly wherever this logic lives and whatever triggers it, whether it's built in or like files on disk, like what are we wanting this to do? And I think the biggest question I have is whether these are just kind of opaque definitions that we would have the set of core ones, but you could drop your own in and they would just kind of live in this world and be managed by this tool. If it's opaque, so this is basically like a glorified kube control apply, or if we are wanting this thing to do more intelligent things like kube control auth reconcile, like additively adds in permissions, but it doesn't remove any permissions. Like you could envision something similar for like looking at a custom resource definition and saying, well, I'm only going to roll this forward. There was a discussion on the mailing list this week about like how do you safely roll forward and not unsafely roll back. So that implies more intelligence built into the tool than just like take YAML and apply it.
Yeah, I think there's also suppositions there. Like we need to define what are the requirements for this management of this, right? whether or not rollback is a requirement, right? What happens if it isn't, right? What are the actual listing of requirements we have for CRD management?
Dan?
Yeah, I think none of these options are very good, honestly. I think the fundamental problem we have is that there's no trigger at the appropriate time. There's no trigger in the entire system at the appropriate time to change the schema definition, right? API server does not compute a time when like all the API servers have joined to a new version and it's appropriate to change the CRDs. The Addon manager doesn't take a lock. I mean, yes, it could, but it doesn't.
No, I'd say more. My thought is that we don't actually understand how CRD versioning upgrade works fully, I don't think. And the current thing would require installing a mutating webhook with.
Well, my point is like the problem everyone said the add-on manager has, like all the components have that problem.
Yeah.
It's not a problem with the add-on manager. It's a problem that we don't generate an event anywhere when like we've latched at a new version. Right, and we have that problem whether we build it into API server or controller manager or add-on manager or some hypothetical schema loader / webhook manager. Like, we still have that problem.
This really has the sounding of like a separate small group of folks who focus on the requirements and the potential proposals for how we want to deal with this. Right? Because we put this document together in haste because people wanted to promote it, and I would say too soon.
Yeah, I agree that a small group of people should probably solve this.
I don't know if we can actually answer some of the core questions that I know that we wanted to answer, but we put this proposal together in haste because it was almost like we wanted to choose one. But I felt super uncomfortable along the way because I felt like we were trying to cook something with twice the heat in half the time, and that doesn't work. So does it sound reasonable to folks to have to set up a separate, I don't know if it's going to be working group underneath API machinery and cluster lifecycle co-manage or something to try and come up with proposals for how they want to deal with this so that we can actually get this traction on this that doesn't seem so scary. It actually seems like it has a life of its own.
I think it'd be good to do a kind of a birds of a feather as opposed to forming a working group because there's not really a specific solution. It's more advising the SIG architecture and other groups on how to proceed, or at least the pros and cons. And I don't think we need the heavyweight governance around a working group necessarily.
I don't particularly care. I think there needs to be a smaller subsection of people who are focused on this problem that have the experience and the history to know what both the lifecycle management of some of the key core components as well as the API aspects that are involved with it.
So I actually raised my hand in the chat. Sorry, I don't have
sorry, I can't see. It's really hard to see.
I don't have a hand button that I can find on this whatever version of Zoom I'm running. Since SIG cluster lifecycle was mentioned, I actually just have a question about that, which is where do we stand on add-on management in SIG cluster lifecycle? I know this is an issue for KubeADM and COPS. And
I believe turn to your left.
Yeah, I know. This is sort of a leading question.
Thought I had written up a preliminary cap, haven't I?
You did. And we started talking.
My own caps, we know we're in trouble. But yes, I think I wrote up a preliminary cap, and we are working through the approval process. I initially presented it last SIG cluster lifecycle meeting, and we are like allowing time for people to comment and review, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Great cap to no.
I'll put a link in chat if I am correct, or in the doc. Sorry.
There's something I was going to say earlier, which is it's a really high bar to add a new step to the rollout process. So if we're adding like a new binary or a new anything, it's nobody enjoys being told that they have to change their rollout tooling.
But it is, I think it is worth keeping in mind though, like whatever we do, no matter how heavyweight or lightweight our solution is, there's going to be installation tools that are like, no, we have our own way of installing things, and we will just use that.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to be super technical, everything we do during installation is optional. It's up to the operator to figure out some replacement if they don't want to run the thing that we provide. But every time I've wanted to add something like, say, the aggregator, we've ended up finding that the path of least resistance is to build it into something that people are already doing, rather than make people add a step to their rollout process. A little bit of that is good and user-friendly, but a lot of it leads to worse factorings and designs than maybe we'd like.
Is there a way to get some operator feedback from the field on what the implications would be from an operations perspective as opposed to our echo chamber?
I can tell you today that users today are already confused as it stands for just the operation and maintenance and lifecycle of Kubernetes itself. Anything that adds to that management and complexity is not desired, right? So simplifying their life and that user experience is my primary driving requirement for any of these efforts.
Can't see who it is in the Google room, but your hand up.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I felt very positive about in the discussion doc was that Tim Hawkins suggested that we figure out exactly how it fits into, say, kubeadm, right? And then we actually do an existence proof. And I think if this group that tackles that issue and addresses how to actually make it happen from the end user perspective in a way that is nice, I think that is a very big step forwards compared to some of the other times when we haven't necessarily given that as much consideration.
Jordan?
I think it's really good to actually prove it out to an actual deployment tool, but just recognizing that stuff that's done in kubeadm, it doesn't mean we did it in kubeadm and now the world has adjusted. That represents work that has to be done by everyone who has written a deployment. So just recognizing that and understanding it doesn't stop with doing
We'd love to get you involved in kubeadm. You could start using it.
in my next 24 hours of the day, I will try to do that.
Okay, so did we decide on what the follow-up action items were?
I think I proposed something, but what do other people think? My proposal is to get a smaller group of people together to come up with a basic proposal of how they want to tackle this.
Right, I was trying to get that down to be more specific. Do you want people to contact you or comment on the doc? Or
I don't necessarily want to own this space because I got enough problems in my life right now, but I can help that group.
Well, maybe let's try to get together a group of people on the mailing list.
I put specific directions in the chat about how to organize a birds of a feather.
Too many windows open.
Are there volunteers, I should ask? Are there people who want to be involved in this effort? Justin, myself, Solly, write it down for the record.
Yeah, I think we should probably loop in some of the people actually working on CRDs too, like at least
I agree.
Make them aware of it. So,
are you volunteering someone?
I probably have to, like, maybe even either Betty or Stefan. I don't know if he's interested.
That's part of the reason.
Okay, if you can loop in the right people, then yeah, I have too many things going on. So.
Yeah, so I would say if you're really truly looking to get a community of interest around this, as opposed to the voices that are currently here, just invite the mailing list for the SIGs that you think are specifically interested, and see if people show up. Of course, this is an effort that favors work over talk, so I mean, we need to have some sort of document at the end of this that advises this group.
Pablo, what is your GitHub ID? Put it in the chat.
I'm sorry, what?
Oh, I'm answering the chat.
Oh,
yeah, you were asking who was interested in, I would like interested because in SUSE we are moving or considering a heavy usage of operators. So we need to figure out how to manage. One of the questions we have in mind is like, you do once, I mean, one operator is nice, but you are deploying like tens of them, and then you have to do some, upgrades or whatever. So we are really interested in understanding how is the life cycle of this stuff. And
So-
by the way, so I will be interested in part of that. That is.
So a quick question I have is, what does this mean for the promotion of other CRDs as core APIs currently?
Well, we just punted on the CSI CRDs because we decided CRDs were not ready, so they're going to not use CRDs. The next thing up is runtime class, probably, maybe. So we need to figure out whether they can be ready in a timeline that is satisfactory for runtime class. I think that's what we need to look at, so we don't end up blocking an unbounded number of other efforts on the project, or pushing this problem onto everybody who's using Kubernetes or building distributions around Kubernetes or deployment tools or whatever. Ken has his hand up. I can't see if other people.
Jordan also does. So you two can battle it out.
Mine's a quick just comment. I think we should also come up with what our criteria for readiness is first. Because it's not clear to me that anyone's actually said this is when I think CRDs will be actually done enough to do any of the things we're talking about. But right now, I think version upgrade is alpha, right? So if I install it once, there is no non-alpha way for me to upgrade to a new version of the CRD.
If you don't need conversion, if all you were doing is bumping the version, then you can upgrade today.
So
if you change schemas, then that is not graduated yet.
Then it's not graduated. So like just figuring out what the criteria is to, it's real, at least it's really unclear to me what the criteria, like when we'll say CRDs are ready, when they're done, what GA criteria looks like.
We just made a cap. I'm pretty sure it's approved. Maybe you should read it.
Okay.
That was webhook admission. CRDs is up next.
Oh, okay.
So there is.
They all mixed together in my
head. Is there
head.
one open or no?
There was an issue and we had discussions around it. I don't think the cap has been opened yet. 114 we were working on webhook admission. 115 we were going to be working on CRDs.
We've got 5 minutes left, so just to reiterate, the action item here is to get the Birds of a Feather group together, come up with some sort of recommendations with the criteria mentioned here, and hopefully be able to act on it. In our last 4 minutes, is there anything, does anybody need to get the last word on anything who hasn't spoken yet?
I did want to answer the question about the runtime class question if no one else has anything. Okay. Tim, you had asked, like, what does this mean for the things that are currently in flight? I think ones that don't depend on any active components that can be purely declarative and are not required, as in if they're not present, it doesn't stop a cluster from coming up. Only people who wanted to use those features would need to worry about getting these set up in their clusters. I think the path is clearer for those, just because of their simplicity and the fact that they're optional. The question about conversion is significant, and I would hesitate to kind of release a beta level CRD and say we now support this when we don't actually have a clear picture about conversion. And so depending on how complex the object is and how confident we are in the current schema, that could influence whether we're willing to promote it, I would say.
All right. Without any further hand raises, we're going to go ahead and call it. Thanks everyone for attending, and definitely looking forward to seeing you in a week. And if anything comes up in the meantime, please leverage the mailing list for things.
Thanks for facilitating the conversation.
Yeah,
Thanks,
have to.
everybody.
Right. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy Thursday.
Bye.